My story begins the day my husband was laid to rest, when my own family treated me like a ghost, dividing my home and mocking my existence. What they never knew was that I carried the truth that built their entire legacy. They thought I was weak, forgotten, fading, but the quiet woman they dismissed was the mind that saved everything. And when the wool was finally red, the house shook not from grief but from the truth they never saw coming. Welcome, my dears, to Granny's Stories Vault. Every day here, you'll find emotional, educational, and deeply touching stories, tales that will refresh your heart and remind you of the strength hidden in silence. Now let's get back to my story. I remember the day after the funeral as clearly as the day I first stepped into that house as a new bride. The roses from my husband's casket were still wilting on the porch when my family, poured through the doors like guests arriving for a celebration rather than mourners returning from a burial. Their footsteps echoed through the halls with a kind of careless confidence, the confidence of people who believed the story of this home had already ended with him. They didn't even see me at first. Or maybe they did and simply brushed past the sight of an old woman in black, standing at the staircase with her hand still resting on the railing he once polished every spring. The house smelled of dust and lilies. They smelled of impatience. "This one should go in the cabin," my grandson declared as he slapped a bright-colored sticker onto the antique side table I received on my wedding day. Another sticker landed on the grandfather clock. Another on the cabinet holding my crystal collection. They moved through the rooms like tourists in a museum, claiming artifacts that meant nothing to them beyond their price tag. My granddaughter stood in the dining room with her phone raised, scanning the space with an interior design app. "We'll knock out this wall once she's settled elsewhere," she said. She didn't bother to lower her voice. They had already decided where elsewhere would be. The mudroom, a space meant for boots and brooms and cold winter coats. They said it was quiet and private, as if solitude were a gift rather than a punishment. My daughter-in-law handed out champagne flutes, her smile too bright for a house that had just lost its heartbeat. "This is Dad's legacy," she said cheerfully. "We should honor it properly." Honor. A word they used only when there was something to gain. They ushered me toward the mudroom with polite instructions and hollow sympathy. Someone had dragged in a folding chair, one leg shorter than the others, and placed it near the utility sink. My plate of food was set on a plastic bin beside an old mop. Dry chicken, overcooked potatoes, not an ounce of seasoning, not a single question about whether I'd eaten. From the other room I heard them laughing. "She looks pale. Maybe she should lie down somewhere else so we can finish sorting. Dad always said she wouldn't outlive him, guess he was wrong once. She built soup, he built an empire." Their cruelty wasn't sharp, it was casual. Casual cuts go deep. I kept my hands steady by holding my cup with both palms, hiding the tremor that came from something far heavier than age. In my sweater pocket, I kept touching the edges of the envelope, those papers I had guarded for years, the ones they didn't know existed, the ones that could melt their greed like frost in sunlight. They didn't know the truth because they never asked. People rarely ask about the hands that held them up. 15 years earlier, when the company staggered on the brink of collapse, it wasn't an executive or banker who saved it. It was a woman standing in her kitchen at midnight, selling her dowry piece by piece. The emerald brooch from my mother, the bangles from my wedding chest, the jeweled necklace worn by every bride in our family for generations. I sold them in silence, wired the money, and whispered to my husband, "Use this. But let them believe it came from you." That night in the mudroom, listening to their laughter echo off the walls, I realized how deeply that silence had cost me. Someone wandered in and nearly jumped seeing me still seated there. "Oh, didn't notice you. The garage fridge has bottled water," he said and disappeared before I could reply. I sat for a long time. Not because I was tired, but because I was remembering. Remembering not only what I had given, but what I still had. When I finally stood, my knees aching, the house felt like it was holding its breath. I looked through the window at the roses by the driveway, the ones my husband planted for me years ago. They were wilting, forgotten, like me, but flowers revive when tended. So do women. I placed my hand over the envelope again. The will reading was soon. They thought I would sit quietly in the corner until life decided to release me. They forgot something important. I was still breathing. What none of them knew was that long before the empire carried his name, the mind that built its foundation belonged to me, and the first crack in their perfect inheritance was about to open beneath their feet. They believed the empire rose on his shoulders alone. They believed he was the genius behind every contract, every expansion, every bold decision that saved the company from ruin. They believed it because he let them, and I let him too. Not out of weakness, but out of love, the kind that wants a man to stand tall even when the world tries to shrink him. But some truths don't fade. They simply wait. The night the company nearly collapsed is engraved in me more deeply than my wedding day. My husband returned home late, the porch light flickering as he stepped inside. His shoulders sagged in a way I had never seen. He didn't speak, not at first. He just loosened his tie, rubbed his brow, and stared into the fireplace like it held the answers to every failure. "We're going under," he whispered finally. "One contract fell through. Another investor backed out. If I don't secure something soon, they'll break the company apart." He wasn't a man who cried, but that night his silence trembled. I went upstairs, opened the drawer that held my last pieces of inheritance. My mother's wedding bracelets, the emerald ring passed down for generations, the gold-studded necklace I wore as a young bride, and I made a decision the family would never imagine. Women make hard decisions quietly. It's how we survive the noise of the world. By morning, the jewelry was gone, melted into the veins of the financial system. Every piece of my past turned into numbers on a bank screen. I wired the money straight into the company's emergency account, signed my name where required, and tucked the receipt into the leather folder I still keep. When I handed him the confirmation slip, he looked at it like it was a rope thrown to a drowning man. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "From someone who believes in you," I said simply. He didn't ask further. He didn't want to know. Pride is a fragile thing, especially for a man carrying the weight of failure. Within 2 days, the loan was approved. The merger went through. Reporters praised his remarkable foresight, his unmatched resilience, his visionary leadership. The board toasted him with champagne. They put his portrait in the lobby. No one toasted me, but I didn't mind. Not then, because I thought quiet sacrifice made a family stronger. But silence isn't always loyalty. Sometimes it becomes a shadow that others use to erase you entirely. What they didn't know, what even he didn't fully understand, was that my role didn't end there. When the company prepared for its IPO 5 years later, he stayed up night after night, rejecting draft after draft from the consultants they paid far too much for. Nothing was good enough, nothing made sense, nothing captured what the company needed to survive the next decade. He grew restless, the board grew impatient, the market grew unstable, and so I did what I had always done. I stepped in from behind the curtain. When he finally fell asleep one night, exhausted, defeated, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and wrote the proposal myself. Every strategy, every projection, every adaptation plan came not from textbooks but from years of watching, listening, learning, thinking. Thinking is a habit they never saw as valuable in a woman. At dawn, I tucked the pages into an envelope and signed it with a pseudonym I had used in college, L. Brightmore. I mailed it the same morning. 2 days later, he came home astonished. "Someone sent a brilliant model," he said, waving the envelope. "Even the handwriting feels familiar." I just smiled into my soup and stirred. That anonymous contribution became the backbone of the IPO. When the company went public, they called it revolutionary. He received awards, recognition, invitations to speak at conferences. And me? I stood beside him at the gala, wearing a borrowed dress, applause ringing for the man whose success was rooted in my unseen ink. But I didn't complain. I didn't demand credit. A family, I believed then, was held together not by glory but by grace. Yet sitting in that mudroom after the funeral, listening to my own grandchildren mock my existence, I realized grace had turned to erasure. And erasure has a way of waking even the quietest soul. The folder I kept hidden beneath the laundry room floorboard holds that original draft, my signature, my handwriting, my proof. And soon, very soon, the world that dismissed me as a harmless old woman will learn exactly who built the foundation they stand on. Because once I opened that old leather folder again, the secrets inside didn't just threaten their inheritance. They threatened the entire story they believed about who built the empire. And the first person I took those papers to changed everything. The morning after they mocked me in my own home, the home I held together with silence and sacrifice, I woke before sunrise. The house was still but not peaceful, still like a battlefield before the smoke rises. still like something waiting to break. I slipped out of the cot they'd pushed into the laundry room and knelt beside the loose floorboard where I'd hidden the leather folder for years. My knees cracked, but I didn't feel a thing. I pulled the board upward and there it was, the folder that had outlived secrets, storms, and every attempt to erase me. Inside were the documents they never imagined existed. The joint trust certificate with my name listed not as a dependent, but as co-executor. The bank memorandum showing the investment I made from selling my dowry. The original handwritten IPO model signed with my old pseudonym. And tucked between the pages, a certified letter from years ago confirming that the proposal was an intellectual property submission, tying authorship to me. They thought I was a woman who made soup and tidied rooms. They had no idea I was the architect behind the empire they worshipped. I slipped the folder into my purse, wrapped myself in my old beige coat, and stepped outside. The morning air was cold, sharp, almost cleansing. They had disconnected my cell phone accidentally, but old habits don't fade. I still remembered the number of the only lawyer who never treated me like a shadow, Mr. Alden. He had represented my husband publicly for decades, but privately long ago he had also advised me. Back when I still had a voice people pretended to hear. I walked 3 blocks to the payphone beside the pharmacy. Coins were cold in my hand as I fed them into the slot. The line rang once. "It's me," I said. There was a long pause, then his voice softened. "Are you ready?" I wasn't ready, I was resolved. When I arrived at his office the next morning, he didn't greet me with pity or surprise. He simply opened the door and said, "Show me." That was all I needed. I sat across from him at the long wooden table and opened the folder piece by piece. My hands did not shake, not this time. First, the trust certificate, he nodded. "Significant," he murmured. Next, the bank memorandum detailing the funds wired 15 years ago, my jewelry turned into the lifeline that saved a collapsing corporation. His brows lifted. "You kept every record." Women always do. Then I slid the most delicate paper across the table, the original IPO strategy written in my cursive. Some ink strokes were faded from age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "You're telling me you wrote the proposal," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm telling you I authored it." He leaned forward, voice dropping. "And your husband knew?" "He suspected," I admitted. "But he didn't want proof. Pride prefers shadows." Beside the handwritten draft, I placed the certified letter from the intellectual property office. The one tying the model to my pseudonym. He drew in a slow breath. This changes everything." But it wasn't enough for the world to believe me, not when the world had already chosen its hero. So he called a handwriting analyst, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and no patience for doubt. She arrived that same afternoon. For hours, she compared my loops and slants, pressure marks and pen lifts to the pages from the folder. By dusk, her conclusion was undeniable. "Authorship is hers," she stated. "Every stroke confirms it." Mr. Alden leaned back in his chair. "Legally speaking, the intellectual property and all profits tied to it belong to you." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat, I didn't even exhale, because this wasn't about money. This was about truth. For years, I let them believe the empire was his triumph alone. I let them forget the woman behind the curtain. I let them erase me piece by piece because I had chosen dignity over recognition. But now they were using that erasure as a weapon. They wanted me gone. They wanted the house. They wanted the inheritance. They wanted the legacy without the burden of remembering who built its spine. Mr. Alden closed the folder gently. "When the will is read, they will hear your name whether they want to or not." I nodded. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something bloom inside me, not anger, not vengeance, but clarity. They thought they buried me, but they had only woken me. What none of them realized was that the next move would flip the entire story upside down, because the will they thought they understood had been rewritten. And the voice waiting inside it was about to shatter their greed in one devastating sentence. The day of the will reading arrived with a coldness that seeped into the walls. Not weather, people. A coldness only greed can create. When I stepped into the law office, no one greeted me. They noticed me only the way you notice a shadow crossing the floor, present but irrelevant. They had dressed for victory. Joseph in a tailored suit he couldn't truly afford. Clarissa in a pearl necklace she already assumed would become hers. My grandchildren scrolling on their phones, bored and impatient, certain the world would hand them whatever they wanted. They came expecting a feast. They did not expect to choke on it. I was guided to the very edge of the polished conference table, a folding chair again, as if discomfort might hurry me into silence. I sat with my purse on my lap, the leather folder tucked safely inside. Mr. Alden entered with the quiet authority that always filled the room long before he spoke. He gave me a subtle nod, the kind that says, "We're ready." "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today we will execute the final wishes of Mr. Harold Brightmore." They straightened, they leaned forward, some even smiled. Poor fools. Mr. Alden opened a small silver recorder and pressed play. The room stilled as my husband's voice filled the air, older, slower, but unmistakably firm. "If my family speaks ill of my wife," he said, "I instruct that $1 million be deducted for every insult." Silence detonated like a bomb. Clarissa's painted smile evaporated. Joseph's mouth fell open. My granddaughter stopped texting mid-swipe. My husband continued, "And based on recorded statements from the week after my passing, the deductions shall be listed as follows." Mr. Alden picked up a sheet of paper and began reading. Not interpretively, not selectively, line by line. 1. She's still breathing, shame. 2. Check her pulse, she's probably gone already. 3. She built soup, he built an empire. 4. She's half dead anyway, put her in the shed. 5. Donate her stuff before she starts haunting the place. My grandson actually tried to laugh until Mr. Alden continued. Verified total 87 recorded insults. The room went white, faces drained, hands shook. That amounts to $87 million in deductions, he concluded. Clarissa sputtered. "This is absurd, she probably misheard." "She wasn't the one recorded," Mr. Alden replied calmly. "Your own voices were." Joseph slammed a fist onto the table. "Dad wouldn't have done that, he loved me." "He did," I said softly, "until you chose to forget how to love back." They finally looked at me, not like I was invisible. Not like a ghost, but like a wall they had just run full speed into. Mr. Alden wasn't done. "With deductions applied," he announced, "the remaining inheritance for Mr. Joseph Brightmore totals $3,800. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. My granddaughter covered her mouth with both hands. My grandson muttered something that sounded like a prayer or a curse. Clarissa turned as red as the scarf she had claimed from my closet. Then Mr. Alden lifted a second folder, thicker, heavier, tied with a silver clasp. He placed it directly in front of me. "As for the primary beneficiary of the estate," he said, "including all intellectual property rights, holdings, and remaining assets, everything passes to Mrs. Alina Brightmore." Clarissa gasped. "She? Her? Why would he?" "Because truth outlasts greed." Inside that folder were the deeds, the patents, the royalty statements, the investment proofs, pages bearing my name where they had never bothered to look. But the shock didn't come from the inheritance. It came from the letter sealed in a separate envelope. Mr. Alden opened it gently and read aloud, "My love, forgive me for every year I let your brilliance remain in shadow. I always knew who saved our legacy, even when I let the world believe otherwise. This estate is yours because it always was." Harold, my breath trembled, not because of the money, not because of the property. Because it was the first time in years I had heard him truly acknowledge me. Joseph swallowed hard. "Mom, I didn't know." "Perhaps. But ignorance born from cruelty is still cruelty." I stood slowly, folding the letter back into the folder. Their eyes followed me, confused, stunned, frightened of a truth they never imagined existed. For the first time, I wasn't the old woman in the corner. I was the center of the story. But they had no idea the will reading was only the first blow. Because there was one more envelope, one they hadn't seen yet, that carried a revelation capable of destroying everything they thought they inherited. The room had fallen into a silence so sharp it could have sliced through the polished conference table. Their faces were pale, trembling, and stripped of the entitlement they walked in with. They thought the humiliation was over. They thought the will reading was the end of the storm, but storms don't end in the middle. They reveal what was always waiting beneath. Mr. Alden cleared his throat and reached into his briefcase once more. His movements were slow, deliberate, instructive, like he was handling something that could ignite the entire room. "This," he said, removing a slim, cream-colored envelope, "is an addendum your father requested be read only after the estate distribution." Joseph straightened, hope flickering in his eyes like a dying candle. Clarissa leaned forward, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. My grandchildren finally put down their phones. Hope is a dangerous thing in the hands of the ungrateful. Mr. Alden slid the envelope open with a letter opener and unfolded the single sheet inside. He didn't preface it. He simply began reading. To my family, my husband's voice began on paper, there is something you must hear and something I should have told the world years ago. Their postures stiffened. You have lived believing the story of this family began with my ambition. But if you knew the truth, you would understand that the backbone of our empire, every contract, every recovery, every victory came from a mind far sharper and steadier than mine. My heart tightened. I knew where this was going, but the children didn't. She is the architect of the stabilization model that built our IPO. She is the silent investor who saved us from collapse. She is the one who learned the financial system so I could stand tall in a world that doubted me. My grandson frowned. Who is he talking about? Mr. Alden didn't answer. He kept reading. The woman you belittled, the woman you sidelined, the woman you treated as a burden is the very reason you had a legacy to chase. Clarissa blinked rapidly. He can't mean, but he did. With this letter, I submit a legally notarized declaration. The intellectual property behind our company's success belongs to my wife. Every strategy you admired came from her hands. The shock was palpable, wide eyes, parted lips, the sound of someone's breath catching in their throat. My granddaughter whispered, "Grandma wrote the IPO?" As if speaking it might summon a different answer. But there wasn't one. Mr. Alden continued reading. When her proposal arrived anonymously, I knew immediately who had written it. I recognized the steady curves of her handwriting, the quiet brilliance in her ideas. I asked her to remain unseen because the board wouldn't follow a woman. She agreed for the sake of survival, not pride. A tremor ran through the room. She sacrificed her identity to preserve our future, not to be praised, not to be remembered, but to protect you. My eyes stung not from sadness, but from the weight of a truth finally spoken. The letter wasn't finished. If you feel anger now directed at me, I allowed the world to applaud me while she stood in the shadows, but I will not let history repeat that mistake. My final wish is that her name stand where mine once did. Joseph rubbed his forehead. This can't be real. But it was. Every word on that page was a crack in the foundation of their entitlement. Mr. Alden folded the letter and placed it gently beside the patent documents, the ones with my pseudonym and the handwriting analysis. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the room itself understood what had just shifted. Finally, Mr. Alden spoke. Your father knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote this. He wanted the truth documented, witnessed, and irreversible. My family stared at me, not with kindness, not with remorse, but with a confused, frightened respect. The kind you give someone whose strength you underestimated. I rose slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. Their gaze followed me like I was someone they'd never seen before. And perhaps they hadn't. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the quiet woman in the background. I was the story, but the truth revealed in that room was only the beginning. Because once my identity as the architect surfaced, a second legal blow was waiting. One that would force them to leave the very house they tried to steal while I was still alive. They walked into the will reading expecting luxury, inheritance, and ownership. They walked out with confusion, humiliation, and something far worse, the truth. But even then, they thought the damage was done. They believed the storm had passed. They didn't realize it was only the first thunderclap. Because after Mr. Alden read the letter exposing my authorship, he reached into his briefcase again, this time retrieving a black envelope sealed with a gold insignia. My husband's family crest, a crest they had already imagined printing on their business cards. This envelope, he said, contains the final clause regarding real estate property and residency rights. Residency rights. I knew exactly what was coming, they didn't. Joseph leaned forward, desperate. Dad wanted me to have the house. He told me every Christmas. Mr. Alden raised a hand. Your father's verbal comments have no legal standing. What matters is what he documented. Clarissa let out a shaky laugh, a tempting charm. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. Greed always tries to negotiate when it senses loss. Mr. Alden opened the envelope, slid out the documents, and read aloud. As executor of my estate, I revoke all previous verbal agreements concerning property allocation. My primary residence and all attached lands shall belong exclusively to my wife. My grandson blinked. But you don't need all that space. And you certainly don't need the wine cellar, my granddaughter added. I didn't bother replying. Mr. Alden continued, voice steady. Any family member who mocked, displaced, or acted with hostility toward my wife after my passing shall be legally required to vacate the property within 48 hours of will execution. The room froze. Clarissa gripped the edge of the table. Vacate what? Mr. Alden looked directly at her. The house. But we've been staying there, she exclaimed. And measuring it for renovations, I added quietly. My words struck harder than I intended. They flinched. Joseph's voice cracked. She can't make us leave. I'm not making you, I said. Your father is. He shook his head. Mom, we didn't mean what we said. But apologies born out of fear aren't apologies. They're survival instincts. Mr. Alden slid another paper forward, the legal notice stamped by the court. This order is already active. All occupants must leave the premises within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in forced removal. Forced removal. The phrase cracked across the room like lightning. My granddaughter whispered, "We're gonna be evicted by Grandma." They never imagined those words in their vocabulary. I never imagined needing to use them. But cruelty demands consequence. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the air in the room felt ashamed. I stood slowly, pulling my coat around my shoulders. My hands didn't shake. Their hands did. You put me in the laundry room, I said softly. You taped your names onto my memories. You planned your futures while leaving me to fade. Clarissa swallowed hard. We were grieving. So was I replied. But grief doesn't justify cruelty. They had no counter-argument. Mr. Alden handed me the keys to the house they tried to erase me from. Mrs. Brightmore, he said, you now have full authority. Authority, a word they never once associated with me. Joseph looked at me desperately. Mom, where will we go? For a moment, I felt the familiar ache of a mother, an ache that wants to protect even when it's undeserved. But I remembered the mudroom, the folding chair, the cold plate of food, the cracking comments about my pulse. You're adults, I said finally. You'll figure it out. Their shoulders sank, their pride folded, their illusions collapsed. As I left the room, my granddaughter whispered, Grandma was the one holding everything together and we never saw it. No. They saw it, they just didn't value it. I stepped into the hallway, the leather folder tucked under my arm, and breathed deeply. The world looked different, brighter, sharper, clearer when seen through the lens of reclaimed dignity. But the storm wasn't over, because one more revelation waited in that folder, one they hadn't heard yet, one that didn't just affect their inheritance, it affected the entire company they believed was theirs. Because when the truth about the intellectual property finally reached the board of directors, the empire they idolized shattered, and the person they had dismissed as half-dead became the most powerful name in the entire corporation. 48 hours? That was all the time the court gave them to vacate the house they had once marched through as if it were already theirs. I should have felt triumphant, but triumph wasn't the feeling that followed me home. What followed me was something steadier, clarity, a clarity sharpened by years of quiet observation. They thought losing the house was the end of their nightmare. They had no idea it was only the beginning. Because the truth inside my folder didn't just shift inheritance. It shifted ownership, not of a home, of an empire. 2 days after the will reading, Mr. Alden called me into his office again. When I arrived, he wasn't alone. Sitting across from him were 2 men I recognized from the company's earliest days, the longest-standing board members, men who had once toasted beside my husband at celebrations I cooked for. They rose when I entered, respectfully. How long has it been? One of them asked gently. Long enough, I replied. They exchanged a glance before Mr. Alden placed the leather folder between us. Eleanor, he said, today we are discussing the intellectual property that built Brightmore Industries. My heart steadied. I had been preparing for this moment for years, even before I realized it. The older board member cleared his throat. We were informed your husband submitted an addendum naming you as the architect of the stabilization model. Architect. A word no one had ever given me before, a word that felt like a key turning in a very old lock. Yes, I answered, I wrote it, every line. And you used a pseudonym? The other asked. L. Brightmore, I confirmed. They nodded. They had seen the handwriting analysis, the certified submissions, the patent documentation, all of it connected not to my husband but to me. You understand, the first board member said gently, that the IPO model legally belongs to its creator. And that creator is you. Which means, the other added, the company has been using your intellectual property without formal licensing for years. Most people would have gasped, panicked, spiraled. I simply lifted my chin. I'm aware, Mr. Alden leaned forward. The corporation's legal department cannot ignore this. Because the patent predates several mergers, partnerships, and expansions, your ownership extends far beyond royalties. How far? I asked. He slid a document toward me, and there it was. In clean, unmistakable text, you are entitled to a controlling interest in Brightmore Industries. Controlling interest. Not a seat at the table. The table. My breath caught not out of shock but out of the weight of recognition. For years, I'd written strategies in the shadows. For years, they'd applauded the wrong name. For years, they'd dismissed me as irrelevant. Now the truth hovered before me like a rising sun. I don't want power, I said quietly. The older board member smiled. Power was never the point, recognition was. Respect, the other added. And accuracy, Mr. Alden finished. They were all correct. I didn't want to run the company. I wanted to correct its story. I wanted the world to know the empire didn't grow from a single man's ambition. It grew from the woman behind him, the woman with ink-stained fingers and a mind that never stopped working, even when the world stopped looking. The board members folded their hands. Mrs. Brightmore, one said, legally you are now the majority owner. What would you like to do? For the first time, I saw my reflection in the glass table, steady, unshaken, certain. I want transparency, I said. The company will acknowledge its true history, publicly, officially, permanently. And after that, they asked. I gave a small, tired smile. After that, I will decide whether to keep the company or dismantle it piece by ungrateful piece. Their eyebrows rose. Mr. Alden hid a smirk. For years, they treated me like a fragile relic. Now they saw the truth. I was the storm. And the first thunder would arrive the moment the company announced on record who built its backbone. As I left the meeting, the winter air felt warmer somehow, like the world had shifted just slightly in my favor. The board would release a public statement the next morning. The children would see it. The investors would hear it. The employees would read it. And the family that dismissed me would face the truth. The woman they insulted was the one signing their future. But before the announcement went public, I returned to the house one last time, and what I found inside made it clear that my family wasn't done fighting. Something they left behind changed everything. The day before the company's announcement, I returned to the house, my house, for the first time since the will reading. The 48-hour deadline had expired that morning. I expected silence, dust, maybe a lingering scent of the cheap cologne my grandson wore. I did not expect what I found. The front door was unlocked. That was my first warning. My second warning came from the trail of hurried footprints across the foyer floor, the kind made by people who left in a panic, not in dignity. They hadn't cleaned, hadn't cleared, hadn't even bothered to close drawers. When greed loses its grip, it drops everything. And that's exactly what they had done. I stepped inside slowly, footsteps echoing through a house that felt as though it had exhaled its tension. The air was lighter, as if relieved to be free of the voices that once treated it like a stage for their entitlement. But the relief didn't last. Because on the living room carpet lay a crumpled stack of papers, documents they had clearly rifled through before being forced to leave. I bent down and picked them up. They were mine, old letters, receipts from jewelry sales, notes written in my handwriting, proof of the sacrifices I'd made for the family, proof they were never meant to see. Someone had been digging. Someone had been looking for leverage. Someone was desperate. And then I heard it. A faint rustle from the hallway. I froze. The house should have been empty. For a moment I wondered if grief was playing tricks on me, but then a shadow moved past the edge of the doorway. Small, fast, uncertain, not Joseph, not Clarissa, not any of the older ones. A child, my youngest granddaughter, Lily. She stepped into the living room with puffy eyes and trembling hands. I had forgotten she was only 12. Forgotten because she had learned to mimic the older ones, rolling her eyes, making comments, laughing at cruel jokes just to fit in. But now she looked like a child caught in a storm she didn't know how to escape. "Grandma," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know you were coming back." "I own the house," I replied calmly. "I have every right to be here." She looked down at her shoes. "I know. Why are you here?" I asked. She swallowed hard. "Mom and Dad, they told everyone to leave fast. They didn't want to be here when you came back, but I forgot something." I waited. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, torn notebook, the kind children use for doodling more than homework. She held it out to me with both hands. "I took it by accident," she said. "I didn't mean to, but after the will reading, I read it." I opened the notebook. It wasn't hers, it was mine. My old scribbles from years ago, ideas for the company, half-formed formulas, outlines of strategies, thoughts I had never shown anyone. Pages filled with the seeds that later became the IPO model. Lily looked up at me with eyes full of fear and something far softer, understanding. "Grandma," she whispered, "I didn't know you were like that." "Like what?" I asked. "Smart." A simple word, a painful word. A word her parents had effectively removed from my identity. I set the notebook aside and took her hand. "Lily, smart women don't disappear, they get buried, there's a difference." Her lip trembled. "They said you were old and confused. And useless, I know, but when I read this," she tapped the notebook, "I knew they lied." Tears welled in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly as if showing emotion might get her scolded. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for the things I said. I thought they were true." Sometimes apologies are real only when they come from someone who hasn't yet learned how to weaponize them. I placed a hand on her cheek. "Thank you for telling me." She nodded shakily. "Are you going to ruin everything? That's what Dad said you'd do." I paused. "Ruin everything? No, reveal everything." "No, Lily," I said gently. "I'm going to tell the truth, the rest is up to them." She looked at the floor. "They're scared." "Really scared?" "They should be." Before she left, she turned back. "Grandma, when people find out who you really are, will you still let us see you?" A question a child asks only when the adults in her life have taught her to expect abandonment. I hugged her lightly. "I never closed the door, Lily, others did." She nodded and ran out, leaving the house finally empty. I stood in the center of the room, holding the notebook that once held my unspoken brilliance. The silence wasn't loneliness, it was reclamation. But just when I thought the storm had cleared, the company's public announcement went viral, and my family's reaction was far louder, far uglier, and far more desperate than anything I'd seen before. The battle for the truth had only just begun. The morning the announcement went public, I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my new, quiet home, tea steeping, sunlight spilling across the floor, when my phone began vibrating with a force that made the teacup tremble. Not one call, not 10, dozens. For a moment, I didn't move. I simply watched the screen flash with unfamiliar numbers, missed calls, notifications, alerts. I already knew what had happened. The board had released the statement. My identity, hidden for years behind a husband's pride and a family's indifference, was now public. Brightmore Industries confirms true author of stabilization model. Anonymous L. Brightmore revealed as founder's wife. New majority owner identified after will execution. Decades of credit corrected overnight. The headlines lit up every news site. My name, my real name, was suddenly everywhere. Eleanor Brightmore, architect of the empire. I expected curiosity. I expected surprise. I did not expect what came next. My social media accounts, untouched for years, flooded with thousands of messages, some from women thanking me for proving brilliance doesn't age, some from strangers apologizing for the world's long history of forgetting women like me, and some from journalists begging for interviews. But I ignored them all, because while the world was waking up, my family was losing its mind. The first call came from Joseph. I let it ring. The second came from Clarissa. I let it ring twice before blocking the number. Then came a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Mom." It was Joseph's voice, strained, frantic, unsteady. "Please, we need to talk." "I'm listening," I said coolly. He exhaled shakily. "Did you see the news? They're calling you, the board is calling you, He couldn't finish. "The architect of the company," I supplied. Silence, then a quiet, defeated yes. "That's because I am." He didn't argue. That surprised me more than anything. "Mom," he began again, "we didn't know. We thought Dad built everything. We thought—" "You thought what you wanted to think," I corrected. "You never asked who helped him. You never wondered where the money came from. You never cared to see who held the walls up so you could lean on them. A small choke of air. He was crying. I'm sorry, he whispered. I was stupid. You were cruel, I corrected again. Stupidity can be fixed. Cruelty takes longer? He didn't deny it. Mom, reporters are calling us, investors are calling, people at the company, they're laughing at us. Laughing at me, saying I inherited nothing because I insulted the person who made everything. That's accurate, I replied. His breath hitched. Is there anything I can do? No, I said firmly. Not for me. Silence. A silence heavy with years of things he should have said, things he should have been. He swallowed audibly. Will you ever forgive us? Forgiveness. Such a small word to ask for something so large. I don't know, I said honestly. Forgiveness requires change, and I have seen none. He didn't answer. It was the first honest silence between us in decades. We hung up. But the day wasn't done with me yet. Because while Joseph was breaking, the rest of the family was breaking louder. My granddaughter posted online claiming the company was lying. My grandson made a video calling me unstable. Clarissa accused me of manipulating an old man's will. Their desperation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. The world, however, did not laugh. Comment after comment shut them down. You mocked the woman who built your wealth. You evicted her to the laundry room. She's the genius and you're ungrateful. And with every passing hour, their lies collapsed. By evening, the company itself had issued another statement defending me and publicly condemning any hostile actions toward Mrs. Brightmore. My identity was no longer a secret. My silence was no longer expected. My value was no longer determined by their convenience. But as night fell, a new message arrived. An unsigned letter slipped under my front door, no return address, just 4 words written in shaky handwriting. We're not finished yet. My heartbeat slowed, not from fear, from familiarity. They weren't done fighting, neither was I, because the family's final move wasn't just desperate, it was dangerous. In the moment I opened their last attempt to silence me, I realized I had one final choice to make: forgiveness or fire. The letter on my doorstep was small, folded twice, and trembling in its creases, as if even the paper understood the fear of the hand that wrote it. We're not finished yet. 4 words meant to intimidate me. 4 words meant to drag me back into the shadows. But I wasn't the same woman they shoved into a laundry room. I wasn't the woman who whispered ideas into envelopes. I wasn't the woman who sold her dowry in silence. I had reclaimed my name, and with it, the spine they thought age had bent. Still, I opened the letter carefully. Inside was not a threat, but something much more revealing. A list. A list of items they believed I owed them. Labeled, numbered. Demands disguised as entitlement. Jewelry Mom promised someday. The antique sideboard we already measured for the cabin. Access to the company's benefits since it was originally Dad's. A fair share of the royalties. A request to reverse the will because it's embarrassing. Embarrassing. After everything they'd done, their greatest suffering was embarrassment. Attached to the list was a final line, written in Clarissa's unmistakably dramatic handwriting. We deserve something, anything, you can't erase us. Erase them? I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letter in my hand, wind brushing at the edges of the paper like it wanted to take it away. They didn't understand anything still. They weren't erased, they were revealed. There's a difference. I placed the letter on the kitchen table and sat down slowly. My tea had gone cold, but the room felt warmer than it had in years. My mind drifted not to anger or vengeance, but to the truth of who they had been before greed hollowed them out. Joseph, as a boy, sitting with me during storms. My granddaughter making cookies beside me, flour on her cheeks. My grandson asking me to clap at his first soccer game. Even Clarissa, once polite, once hopeful, before she let envy sharpen her tongue. People aren't born cruel. They become cruel when comfort blinds them. The phone rang again. This time I answered. It was the company's chairman. Mrs. Brightmore, we're ready to finalize your position. The press conference is tomorrow. I closed my eyes. This was the moment. The moment I could take everything, control, power, every last piece of the empire that forgot who built it. But power without peace is another kind of prison. Before we finalize anything, I said, I need to make one request. Name it. I want the truth displayed in the company's lobby. Permanent, a plaque with both our names, mine and my husband's, acknowledging the partnership, the real story. Done, and after that, I added quietly, I want to retire. He paused. Are you sure? Yes. I've already written enough chapters, it's time I choose how the last one's read. He understood. When I hung up, I looked again at the list on my table, the insults wrapped as requests. And for the first time, instead of anger, I felt something unexpected. Freedom, true freedom, not the kind granted by money, not the kind granted by a will, the kind granted by truth finally spoken out loud. I picked up a pen and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the list. I owe you nothing, but I do not owe you harm either. The next morning, I mailed each of them a copy of that sentence. No explanations, no arguments. No bitterness, just truth. And then I packed a suitcase and moved to the small penthouse near the sea, the one filled with sunlight and quiet where I could hear myself think, where I could reclaim the years lost to silence. Every morning, I walk past the wooden sign on my door. This house was funded by a burden. Enjoy the silence. And every evening, I sit with a cup of tea, feeling the weight of my life finally settle where it always belonged, on my own shoulders, not on the expectations of others. Forgiveness, perhaps one day. Fire, only if they throw the first spark. For now, I choose neither. I choose peace. Because the woman they buried under assumptions didn't just rise, she reclaimed her story, every word of it. The end.